everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Athenaeum this evening and our second lecture for the 2013 Arts and Culture series. My name is Mel Rice, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Development here at the Athenaeum. It's great to see everybody here tonight after our snowstorm. I'm glad it happened yesterday and not tonight. We created the Arts and Culture series last year to allow members of our community and beyond to share their passions and experiences with patrons and friends of the Athenaeum. It is the goal of the Athenaeum, through her staff and trustees, to continue serving as stewards of our culture and heritage and develop a greater exchange for learning and experience. We are pleased to host 9 lectures this year, and a copy of the 2013 lecture schedule is on your chair. Like many of the programs and events hosted by the Athenaeum, tonight's event is free, thanks to the many patrons, friends, businesses, and sponsors who donate to the Athenaeum. This support, whether through work, wealth, or wisdom, provides the crucial resources necessary to continue our mission to support lifelong learning. I wish to encourage you to hopefully make a donation in gratitude for this evening's lecture. May I please ask everyone to turn off your mobile devices, turn your cell phones off if you have them on. This evening, we are having this event recorded by KATV Kingdom Access Television, and thank you to Jamie Dimmick and his crew for taping our event. It is a great honor to welcome Nancy Marie Brown to the Athenaeum this evening. Like Greek and Roman mythology, Norse myths are still with us, inspiring storytellers from J.R.R. Tolkien to A.S. Byatt and Neil Gaiman. Surprisingly, most of what we know about Valhalla and the Valkyries, Odin and the Well of Wisdom, the mighty Thor, or the Twilight of the Gods was written by a 13th century Icelandic chieftain, Snorri Sturluson. Snorri was as unscrupulous as the gods he created. In Songs of the Vikings, a new biography just published by Palgrave Macmillan, author Nancy Marie Brown is here to bring Snorri Sturluson's story to life. Song of the Vikings was recently awarded Book of the Year. Nancy is the author of the highly praised books of nonfiction, including The Abacus and the Cross, the story of the Pope who brought the light of science to the Dark Ages, and The Far Traveler, Voyages of a Viking Woman, and they're available for sale after the lecture over there on the table. She holds a Master of Arts degree in Comparative Literature from Penn State and has studied Icelandic literature and culture since 1978. Formerly the editor of the award-winning magazine Research Penn State, she lives in Linden, Vermont, where she keeps 4 Icelandic horses and an Icelandic sheepdog. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Marie Brown.
Thank you. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk to you about Song of the Vikings, as Mel just told you. And like most of my books, this biography of a 13th century Icelandic chieftain has a long backstory. It begins when I was about 4 years old and my babysitter read aloud The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I discovered The Lord of the Rings when I was 13. And through my college days, Tolkien was my favorite author, in spite of the scorn that such a confession brought down on an English major at an American university in the late 1970s, where fantasy was derided as escapist. Then in a course on comparative mythology, I was assigned the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. Page 41 in Gene Young's 1965 translation was the turning point of my literary life. I read, "The gods seated themselves on their thrones and held council, and remembered how dwarfs had quickened in the earth. By the decree of the gods they acquired human understanding and the appearance of men, although they lived in the earth and in rocks. Modsognir was the most famous, and after him, Durin." Durin? I knew that name. In the list of dwarves that filled the rest of page 41 and spilled over onto 42, I recognized many more names from The Hobbit. Bifur, Bafur, Bombur, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Gandalf. What was Tolkien's wizard doing in medieval Iceland? I read Tolkien's biography, where I learned about the club that he created at Oxford University to translate Icelandic sagas. I met a professor who had a bookcase full of sagas that he lent me, one after the next. When I ran out of translations, I found another professor to teach me Old Norse. I went to Iceland, and like William Morris and many other writers before and since, I traveled by horseback through the wind-riven wilderness to the last homely house. I wondered why Iceland's landscape seemed so familiar. Then I learned that Tolkien had read William Morris's Journals of Travel in Iceland and created from them the character of the home-loving hobbit Bilbo Baggins and much of the setting for his quest. This painting by Tolkien is just a slight exaggeration of an Icelandic scene, as you can see. The name of the wizard Gandalf Tolkien had plucked from Snorri's list of dwarves. In the first draft of The Hobbit, the wizard's name was Bladderthin. Yeah, I like that one. Okay, why are we not going forward? Hello? Did you just freeze on me? Okay. Do we have any technological people here? There, thank you. But Gandalf's character, Tolkien wrote, was Odinic. He derived from Snorri's tales of the Norse god Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, the shaman and shapeshifter, the poet with his beard and his staff and his wide-brimmed floppy hat, his vast store of riddles and runes and ancient lore, his entertaining after-supper tales, his super-swift horse, his magical arts, and his ability to converse with birds. The fireworks and the pipe smoking are wholly Tolkien's own. On the left here is a drawing of Snorri's Odin made in 1886, before Tolkien was born. On the right is Gandalf, as portrayed by Ian McKellen in Peter Jackson's movie of The Lord of the Rings. So who was Snorri Sturluson? It took me 30 years after meeting Snorri's Gandalf on the page before I thought to answer that question, and Song of the Vikings is the result. So now I'm going to read to you from the introduction, which is titled The Wizard of the North. In the year 1220, Snorri Sturluson sailed home from Norway. He was one of the richest men in Iceland, holder of 7 chieftaincies, owner of 5 profitable estates and a harbor, husband of an heiress, lover of several mistresses, a fat man, soon to go gouty, a hard drinker, a seeker of ease, prone to soaking long hours in his hot tub while sipping stout ale, not a Viking warrior by any stretch of the imagination, but clever, crafty, cunning, and ambitious, a good businessman, so well versed in the law that few other Icelanders could out-argue him, a respectable poet and a lover of books. At age 42, he was at the height of his power. Snorri, son of Sturla, was a contemporary of Saladin, who battled Richard the Lionheart and his crusaders in Jerusalem. During Snorri's lifetime, Genghis Khan and his Mongol horde broke through the Great Wall of China and plundered Beijing, then turned west to conquer Russia, Hungary, and Poland. Francis of Assisi, charmed by birds and wild beasts, founded the mendicant order of Franciscan monks at this time. Just before Snorri's birth, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, was killed by 4 knights hoping to win the favor of King Henry II of England. 3 years before Snorri's visit to Norway, Henry's son, King John, signed the Magna Carta, acknowledging that his power as king was limited by English law. In 1217, John's 10-year-old successor, Henry III, struck up a friendship with the 14-year-old king of Norway, Haakon, who many years later would order Snorri put to death. The 2 boy kings sent each other presents. From Norway came 13 Icelandic falcons, 3 white and 10 gray, walrus ivory and elk's antlers, a live elk, and some years later, a live polar bear. From England came the earliest romances of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, written in Anglo-Norman French, as well as an architect who built Haakon a great stone hall modeled on Henry's palace at Westminster. Snorri had spent the years 1218 to 1220 traveling abroad. On the quay at Bergen, departing for home, he tossed off a praise poem about Earl Skuli, said to be the handsomest man in Norway for his long red blonde locks. In response, the Earl gave Snorri the ship he was to sail in and many other fine gifts. Young King Haakon honored Snorri with the title of landed man or baron, one of only 15 so named. The king also charged Snorri with a mission. He was to bring Iceland, then an independent republic of some 50,000 souls, under Norwegian rule. Or so says one version of the story. The other says nothing about a threat to Iceland's independence. Snorri was not asked to sell out his country, simply to sort out a misunderstanding between some Icelandic farmers and a party of Norwegian traders. A small thing, a few killings to even out, a matter of law. Iceland was a 7-day sail west of Norway. Wondering how long I'm going here. Tipped on the southern edge of the Arctic Circle, the island earns its name. It holds the largest glacier in Europe. The first sight sailors see as they approach Iceland is the silvery gleaming arc of the sun reflecting off the ice cap. Closer in, the eye is struck by the blackness of the shore, the lava sand, the cliffs reaching into the sea in crumpled stacks and arches, the rocks and crags all shaped by fire. For Iceland is a volcanic land. Even when an eruption is not in progress, steam from its hot springs rises high in the air. Fire and ice have shaped this island. Its central highlands, half its total area, are desert. Ash, ice, moonscapes of rock. Grass grows well along Iceland's coasts, but little else thrives. There are no tall trees, and so no shipbuilding, a dangerous lack for island dwellers. Other natural resources are equally scarce. Iceland has no gold, no silver, no copper, no tin. The iron is impure bog iron, difficult to smelt. The first settlers, Vikings emigrating from Norway and the British Isles between 870 and 930, chose Iceland because they had nowhere else to go, nowhere they could live, free of a king. At least, that's how the story goes. Iceland has many such stories. The Arctic winter nights are long. To while away the dark hours, Icelanders, since the time of the settlement, told stories, recited poems, and once the Christian missionaries taught them the necessary ink, quill, and parchment technology in the early 11th century, wrote and read books aloud to each other. 3 of those books, including the most influential, are linked to Snorri Sturluson. So the short answer to that question, who is Snorri Sturluson, may be he was the most influential writer of the Middle Ages in any language. When Snorri began writing his books, the literature that was popular in the courts of Europe were the romances of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. These tales of chivalry, written in French, were translated into Old Norse for young King Haakon, the king who many years later would put Snorri to death. They had an enormous impact on the Norse world. The old Viking ideals of generosity and valor were replaced by new chivalric ideals of courtesy and high-mindedness. The life of a Christian knight in the Arthurian romances is one of idleness and luxury, punctuated by gallant adventures in which he succors the weak, while at the same time showing his deep-seated contempt for anything practical. No chivalrous king could be praised for being, quote, deft with his hands and skillful in all smith's work, as Snorri praises King Olaf the Stout of Norway. In these pictures, you see 3 13th century French images of chivalry and 1 Norwegian one. When Snorri came to Norway for the first time in 1218, he must have been horrified. I imagine this was his expression. This young king would rather read about British legends than the splendid deeds of his own ancestors, the Viking kings. The Viking poetry Snorri so loved was dismissed as old-fashioned and too hard to understand. These chess pieces, known as the Lewis chessmen, were carved during Snorri's lifetime. A recent theory says they were even made in Iceland. To reintroduce the young king to his heritage and to gain influence at court, Snorri Sturluson began writing his books. Writers of prose in his day did not sign their works, so we cannot be 100% certain of his authorship. He was named as author of the Edda in the early 1300s, of Heimskringla, the history of the kings of Norway, by the 1600s, and of Egil's Saga not until the 1800s. The arguments in each case are, to me, convincing. The three works chime, they create a world. Because of Snorri's Edda, tiny Iceland has had an enormous impact on our modern world. All the stories we know of the Vikings' pagan religion, the Norse myths of Valhalla and the Valkyries, of one-eyed Odin and the Well of Wisdom, of red-bearded Thor and his hammer of might, of two-faced Loki and the death of beautiful Balder, of lovesick Freyr and lovely Freya, the Rainbow Bridge, the great ash tree Yggdrasil, the world-wrapping Midgard serpent, Heimdall's horn, the eight-legged horse Sleipnir, Ragnarok, or the twilight of the gods. All the stories we know of the gods whom we still honor with the names Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. For all of these stories, Snorri is our main and sometimes our only source. He may be the most influential writer that you've never heard of. His Edda, the most important book you've never read. A 1909 translation calls Snorri's Edda the deep and ancient wellspring of Western culture. Introducing an English translation in 1954, an Icelandic scholar remarked that no one now read it as a textbook on mythology. He was wrong. Not only did my comparative mythology class at Penn State use it that way in 1977, all books on Norse or Scandinavian mythology rely on Snorri's creation. There is very little else to go on. We have poems containing cryptic hints. We have runestones like this one, whose blunt images tantalize. Only Snorri gives us stories with beginnings and ends and explanations. Though he meant his Edda to be a textbook on Viking poetry, it has become, quote, one of the principal quarries of historians of religion. Our modern understanding of the ancient Scandinavian belief system, and especially its peculiar grim humor, in the words of another scholar, is a product of Snorri's imagination. I'm going to give you an example. Here is Snorri's creation story with some of my pictures of Iceland in the background. This is also an advertisement if anybody wants to go to Iceland. In the beginning, Snorri wrote, there was nothing. No sand, no sea, no cooling wave, no earth, no heaven above. Nothing but the yawning, empty gap, Gununga Gap. All was cold and grim. Then came Surt with a crashing noise, bright and burning. He bore a flaming sword. Rivers of ice, rivers of fire flowed till they turned hard as slag from an ironmaker's forge, then froze to ice. The ice rime grew, layer upon layer, till it bridged the mighty magical gap. Where the ice met sparks of flame and still flowing lava from Surt's home in the south, it thawed and dripped. Like an icicle, it formed the first frost giant, Ymir, and his cow. Ymir drank the cow's abundant milk. The cow licked the ice, which was salty. It licked free a handsome man and his wife. They had 3 sons, one of whom was Odin, the ruler of heaven and earth, the greatest and most glorious of the gods, the All-Father. Odin and his brothers killed Ymir. From his body they fashioned the world. His flesh was the soil, his blood the sea. His bones and teeth became stones and scree. His hair were trees, his skull was the sky, his brain the clouds. From his eyebrows they made Middle Earth, which they peopled with men, crafting the first man and woman from driftwood they found on the seashore. So Snorri explains the creation of the world in the beginning of his Edda. Partly, he is quoting an older poem, the Song of the Sibyl, whose author he does not name. Partly, he seems to be making it up, especially the bit about the world forming in a kind of volcanic eruption and then freezing to ice. If this myth were truly ancient, there could be no volcano. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Scandinavian homelands, are not volcanic. Only Iceland, discovered in 870, when Norse paganism was already on the wane, is geologically active. In medieval times, Iceland's volcanoes erupted 10 or a dozen times a century, often burning through thick glaciers. There is nothing so characteristic of Iceland's landscape as the clash between fire and ice. Ymir's cow may have been Snorri's invention, too. No other source mentions a giant cow, nor what the giant Ymir lived on. A cow to Snorri would have been the obvious source of monstrous sustenance. Like all wealthy Icelanders, Snorri was a dairyman. He was also a Christian. It fits with his wry sense of humor for the first pagan god to be born from a salt lick. It's funny, only Vermonters laugh at that. People in New York City, no, not a smile. Finally, the idea that Odin was the All-Father, who gave men a soul that shall live and never perish, and who welcomes the righteous to Valhalla after death, is Snorri's very Christian idea. He was trying to make the old stories acceptable to a young Christian king who had been brought up by bishops. Snorri goes on to describe the gods and their glorious city of Asgard. The god Odin, shown here in an 18th century manuscript, seems to have been his favorite. Odin had a high throne from which he could see what everyone was doing everywhere in the world, in the 9 worlds. In case he missed something, his ravens, thought and memory, flew over the world each day collecting news. Odin understood everything he saw. He was very wise, especially after he traded an eye for a sip from the well of wisdom. Odin had the best horse, the 8-legged Sleipnir, depicted here in an illustration by W.G. Collingwood in 1908. Snorri tells 2 memorable tales about Sleipnir. In Odin's feast hall, Valhalla, dead heroes ate unlimited plates of pork and drank unending horns of mead, served by beautiful Valkyries. Finally, Odin gave men the gift of poetry. At least in Snorri's book he did. Snorri's tale of the honey mead that turns all drinkers into poets is dismissed by modern critics as, quote, one of his more imaginative efforts. Like much of what we call Norse mythology, he simply made it up. The story begins with the feud between the Aesir gods and the Vanir. They declared a truce and each spat into a crock to mark it. Odin took the spittle and made it into a man. Truce Man traveled far and wide, teaching men wisdom until he was killed by the dwarves. They told Odin that Truce Man had choked on his own learning. The dwarves poured his blood into a kettle and 2 crocks, mixed it with honey, and made the mead of poetry. To pay off a killing, the dwarves gave the mead to the giant Suttung, who hid it in the depths of a mountain with his daughter as its guard. Odin set out to fetch it. He tricked Suttung's brother into helping him, and they bored a hole through the mountain. This illustration was done in 2010 by a Czech artist who goes by the name Helenim. Odin changed into a snake and slithered in, returning to his glorious god form to seduce Suttung's lonely daughter. He lay with her for 3 nights. For each night she paid him a sip of mead. On the first sip, he drank dry the kettle. With the next 2 sips, he emptied the crocks. Then he transformed himself into an eagle and took off. Suttung spied the bird. Suspicious, he too changed into giant eagle form and made chase. It was a near thing. To clear the wall of Asgard, Odin had to squirt some of the mead out backwards. The men who licked it up can only write doggerel. The rest of the mead he spat into the vessels the gods had set out. He shared it with exceptional men and women. They are called poets. So whenever you hear a very bad poem, imagine that poet on his hands and knees outside the wall of Valhalla, looking up bird droppings. Snorri, of course, was an excellent poet. He wrote his Edda originally to teach the young King Haakon shown here on the left, the ins and outs of Viking poetry. For the Vikings were not only fierce warriors, they were very subtle artists. Their poetry had an enormous number of rules for rhyme and meter and alliteration. It also had kennings. Snorri defined kennings in his Edda, and he may also have coined the term. As Snorri explained, there are three kinds. It is a simple kenning to call battle spear clash. It is a double kenning to call a sword fire of the spear clash. And it is extended if there are more elements. Kennings are rarely so easy to decipher as these. Most kennings refer quite obscurely to pagan myths. Here's one of Snorri's own verses with a literal translation, and I'll just read the translation. The noble hater of the fire of the sea defends the woman friend of the enemy of the wolf. Prows are set before the steep brow of the confidant of the friend of Mimir. The noble, all-powerful one knows how to protect the mother of the attacker of the worm. Enjoy, enemy of neck rings, the mother of the troll wife's enemy until old age. Good stuff. As Kevin Warner, the translator of this stanza, notes, you need to know 5 myths and the family trees of 2 gods, or this poem is nonsense. Who is the hater of the fire of the sea? Who is the enemy of the wolf? Who is the mother of the troll wife's enemy? What does it all mean? Take away the kennings, and you can translate this verse simply. A good king defends his land. But then you lose all the poetry. Kennings were the soul of Viking poetry. One modern reader speaks of the, quote, sudden, unaccountable surge of power that comes when you finally perceive in the stream of images the story they represent. For example, here is the enemy of the wolf. Odin fighting the giant wolf Fenrir at Ragnarok in an illustration by Deborah Hardy from 1909. But as Snorri well knew, when those stories were forgotten, the poetry would die. That's why, when he wrote his Edda to teach the young king of Norway about Viking poetry, he filled it with Norse myths. But Snorri is not only the Homer of the North, he is also its Herodotus. We know the history of Scandinavia in the Viking Age almost entirely through Snorri. The title of his second book, Heimskringla, means the round world or the orb of the earth. It is a set of 16 sagas about Norse kings and earls, both pagan and Christian, from the ancient days of Odin the wizard king through King Magnus, who was deposed in 1177, the year before Snorri's birth. This is the death of King Olaf the Stout, later known as Olaf the Saint, in 1030 from the Flateyjarbók manuscript. The history of the world is but the biography of great men. The Victorian philosopher Thomas Carlyle proclaimed this in 1840 upon reading Heimskringla, and Snorri is indeed a deft biographer. Through vivid portraits of kings and sea kings, raiders and traders, he created the Viking image so prevalent today, from the heroes of sports teams to the bloodthirsty berserks of movies and video games. In his third book, Egil's Saga, Snorri expanded the archetype, creating the 2 competing heroic types who would give Norse culture its lasting appeal. The perfect Viking is tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, a stellar athlete, a courageous fighter, an independent, honorable man who laughs in the face of danger, dying with a poem or quip on his lips. He is like Egil's brother and uncle in this saga. Or he is like Egil, his father and his grandfather, dark and ugly, a werewolf, a wizard, a poet, a crafty schemer who knows every promise is contingent, in fact, something like Snorri himself, as he is portrayed in a saga written by his nephew, Saga Sturla. With Egil's Saga, Snorri established the genre of saga. From the Forsyte Saga in 1906 to the Twilight Saga today, we've grown used to our books or their movie adaptations being called sagas. A saga is a long and detailed novel about several generations of a family. But saga is an Icelandic word. It comes from the Icelandic verb segja, to say. Snorri Sturluson's Egil Saga is the first book that we would recognize as a saga. It's also one of the best of the Icelandic sagas and inspired many imitations, including Njál's Saga, which might have been written by his nephew. Snorri Sturluson is a fantastic character in his own right. A lover of poetry, a writer of history and sagas, a teller of myths, Snorri was one of the richest men in Iceland in the early 1200s. It was the age of the Sturlungs, named for Snorri and his brothers, a violent period during which Iceland's golden age came to a dismal end. This portrait was drawn by the 19th century Norwegian artist Christian Krogh. And that is me in 1986. Iceland was discovered in the late 800s by Vikings sailing ships like this one. When they settled Iceland, the Vikings established a commonwealth. For almost 400 years, Iceland had no king. It was the only government in medieval Europe to be based wholly on a representative parliament of chieftains constrained by a code of law. During the age of the Sturlungs, that proto-democracy self-destructed. The chieftains fought and killed each other. Based here at Reykholt, Snorri held 9 of the 39 chieftaincies in Iceland. He could call up an army of 1,000 armed warriors in a country whose total population was under 50,000. He himself did not fight, but paid or coerced others to do his fighting for him. Many of his men lost hands or legs fighting his battles. Some, captured, were blinded or gelded, favorite punishments of the time. But Snorri remained a popular leader. At his grand estate, imagined here by an Icelandic artist based on archaeological finds, Snorri gave excellent feasts with storytelling and songs and lots of stout ale. Notice the hot tub right outside the front door there. Twice Snorri was named law speaker, the only elected post in the Icelandic Commonwealth. His duties included running the yearly parliament and the law courts. He had few scruples and often twisted the law to favor himself and his friends. As a family man, he was just as self-serving. He married a wealthy woman, then left her when he had control of her property, chiefly this valuable estate of Borg. He kept several mistresses before establishing a, quote, partnership with another heiress, a woman named Haltveig, who was 20 years his junior. They were apparently quite fond of each other. His daughters were forced into unhappy marriages to further his political goals. He argued with both his sons over money. Snorri was fat, troubled by gout, and given to soaking long hours in his hot tub, shown here on the right, while drinking stout ale, not, as I said, a Viking warrior by any stretch of the imagination. These stone steps were discovered by archaeologists in 2002. They lead from Snorri's writing studio down a tunnel that opens onto the hot tub, as shown in this reconstruction. It is a geothermally heated hot tub. Shortly after finishing his classic books, Snorri was murdered. He had betrayed Iceland's other chieftains and made a pact with the king of Norway, selling out Iceland's independence so he himself could be called a baron. And then, rather foolishly, Snorri had betrayed the king when a pretender to the Norwegian throne, Duke Skuli, offered to make him an earl. So I'm going to read you another short passage from Song of the Vikings, and this is Snorri's death scene. Word had come of Duke Skuli's death late in 1240. Snorri had mourned his friend and tempered his ambitions. His agreement with the Duke, Earl of something, had fortunately not gotten out. Or so Snorri thought. In secret, Gissur of Haukadal had become King Haukon's new favorite among Iceland's chieftains. Gissur held a damning letter from the king that named Snorri a traitor. The king may not have accused Snorri of colluding with the false King Skuli. He did not have to. Everyone knew Snorri was a traitor, if a minor one. On the quay at Bergen, when Snorri accepted the title of baron in 1220, he had sworn King Haukon his allegiance. Yet he publicly defied the king's written command and sailed from Norway in the spring of 1239. The king ordered Gissur to capture Snorri and send him back to Norway, or to kill him. Gissur bided his time. Then in June 1241 came a shock from which Snorri could not recover. His beloved Halveg died of sickness. This seemed to Snorri a very great loss, writes his nephew, and so it was for him. He was paralyzed with grief, all at sea, careless of his own safety, as if his world had ended. Dividing Halveg's inheritance with her sons, Clying and Orm, who had lived with him since they were boys, Snorri bungled it. They asked for half of Snorri and Halveg's joint property, as if the couple had been married. Snorri quibbled. He'd share everything to the east of Thingvellir, the lands Halveg had brought into their partnership, but no part of anything in the west. Was it greed, as his nephew implies, or good business sense to refuse to divvy up the church estates? Was it greed or just careful accounting to point out that he'd bought the island of Bessastad with his own money? He gave Halveg's sons half of his money and his valuables, even half of his precious books, but managed only to make enemies of them. Clying and Orm rode to Gissur to complain. It was the excuse Gissur had been waiting for. He sent word north to Kolbein the Young. The two met secretly in the far highlands in the black sand wasteland between the glaciers. Gissur showed Kolbein the king's damning letter. They drew in Arni the Quarrelsome, who had also, along with Kolbein, been Snorri's son-in-law once. Arni was King Haukon's man. He had carried the letter from Norway, though he had not known its contents. They told Halveg's sons. Orm refused to have anything to do with the plot and rode off, but Clying joined them. Someone tried to alert Snorri. Late in September, he asked his son Oreikja and his nephew Saga Sturla to meet him at Söderfell, where Tumi, Sigvat's son, then lived, another nephew. Snorri was very cheerful, Saga Sturla reports. They sat around drinking beer and discussed the problem of Halveg's sons. Snorri showed them an anonymous letter he had received. It was a kind of coded message, and they were unable to read it, but it seemed to them to be some sort of warning. Snorri folded it back up. It seemed he just didn't care anymore. They would never see him again. Snorri rode home to Reykholt. He posted no guard on his elaborate wall. He may even have left the drawbridge down or the hidden door to the hot tub unbarred. Gissur had spies watching the estate. Late at night, on September 22nd, he rode up with 70 men. Kolbein's army of 400 blocked the pass to the north. Clying and Arni the Quarrelsome barred the way west. Gissur's men walked into Reykholt unopposed. They broke into the building where Snorri slept. He leaped out of bed in his nightshirt and ran next door into the fine Norwegian-style loft house he had built at the height of his power 20 years before. He was heading, perhaps, for his writing studio and the secret spiral stair that led from it to the tunnel and the hot tub and escape. It is cold in Iceland in late September. The birch leaves are bright gold, the berry shrubs crimson, the songbirds have all flown. Swans flock in the marshlands, sounding their haunting note. Night falls quickly and lingers long. The wind has the bite of ice. When the rain lets up, the northern lights wash the sky with streams of emerald and turquoise and sometimes blood. An old fat man in his nightshirt, barefoot, would not get far in the cold and dark of a late September night. In the loft house, Snorri met Arnbjorn, one of the priests of Reykholt. They decided that Snorri should go into the cellar, Saga Sturla writes. This cellar did not connect with the tunnel, as near as archaeologists can tell. It might have been simply a storeroom above ground for beer, ale, and wine. Snorri hid there, alone in the dark, weaponless, shivering, while Gissur's 70 men loudly searched every room in every house. Gissur found Arnbjorn the priest and asked where Snorri was. He said he didn't know. The priest was a poor liar. Gissur did not believe him. He said slyly that they couldn't very well come to an agreement with him if they couldn't find him. The priest thought Snorri might be found if he were promised quarter. Did he inadvertently look toward the door or the trap door to the cellar as he said this? for at his words they discovered where Snorri was. Gissur gave no promises. He sent 5 men, thugs all, into the cellar. The captain gestured to one of his mates. "Strike him down," he said. "Don't strike," said Snorri. "Strike, don't strike." The man struck. So did another. Snorri's ambition to be the Earl of Iceland not only cost him his life, it cost his country its independence. In 1262, 21 years after his death, Iceland became a colony of Norway, which was later taken over by Denmark. The Golden Age was over. Iceland descended into its own dark ages of colonial repression. Until about 1600, the island was known to the rest of the world only for its rich offshore fishing grounds, its barbaric, uncultured people said to wash in urine and dine on candle wax, and its volcanoes, one of which, shown here, was known as the mouth of hell. Then in 1609, Snorri Sturluson was resurrected. A patriotic Icelander paraphrased Snorri's works in a portrait of his country written in Latin. Fatefully, he published it in Germany. Translations from Old Norse soon appeared throughout Europe. The craze led in one direction to the Gothic novel and ultimately to modern heroic fantasy. Snorri influenced writers as various as Thomas Gray, better known for his Elegy in a Country Churchyard, William Blake, Matthew Arnold, Thomas Carlyle, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Sir Walter Scott, Robert Browning, Longfellow, Ibsen, William Morris, Tolkien, Thomas Hardy, Hugh MacDiarmid, W.H. Auden, Paul Muldoon, Seamus Heaney, Gunter Grass, Jorge Luis Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Poole Anderson, Ursula K. Le Guin, Jane Smiley, Michael Chabon, Neil Gaiman, and A.S. Byatt, who rewrote Snorri's Tale of Ragnarok in 2011. But in another direction, the rediscovery of Snorri's works led to Hitler's master race. Many new fans saw Snorri's gods and giants, kings and heroes as freedom fighters who despised all southern luxuries. Snorri's characters established a government, quote, dictated by good sense and liberty, said the English bishop Thomas Percy in 1770. He claimed these Old Norse ideals were really Old English. His counterparts in Germany, rather more successfully, labeled them Germanic. German nationalism also provided the subtext of Grimm's fairy tales. Jacob Grimm, being a scholar of Old Norse, it is no surprise that his German mythology of 1835 mostly paraphrases Snorri. But the study of myths and fairy tales, folklore, presupposes a folk with a common past and values. By the mid-1800s, the ancient Germanic folk included not only the Anglo-Saxons in England, but all of Scandinavia, as well as the parts of France and Russia that, according to Snorri, had been settled by the wizard king Odin in ancient times. In 1851, a translation of Snorri's Edda was given to Richard Wagner, inspiring his stirring cycle of operas, The Ring of the Nibelungs. The Ring became the German national epic. With its greedy, Jewish-seeming dwarves and its bold, blonde heroes, it reinforced the mindset that produced Nazism. Racist and anti-Semitic societies in the early 20th century took Norse names. One was even called the Edda Society, named after Snorri's most famous book. I'm going to hang up on this one again. Hello, we're here. It does not like me today. We have a nice Nazi poster coming. Hello. This has never done this before. Nothing. Okay, there's a Nazi poster. Oh, good. In 1945, 127,000 copies of a popular edition of the Edda was printed. The last 11,000 copies were labeled Special Edition for the Hitler Youth. These were printed in German. Snorri's Tale of Ragnarok, the final battle before the rise of a new world order, was taken as a metaphor for the Third Reich. J.R.R. Tolkien was determined to restore Snorri to the English canon. Reading Snorri was more important than reading Shakespeare, he argued, because Snorri was more central to our language and our modern world. Egg, ugly, ill, smile, knife, fluke, fellow, husband, birth, death, take, mistake, lost, skulk, ransack, brittle, brag, and law, among many other common English words, all derive from Old Norse. As for Snorri's effect on modernity, it was soon to mushroom. Tolkien's The Hobbit, published in 1937, and The Lord of the Rings, published in 1954, created an entire new entertainment industry inspired by Snorri's works. In polls taken around the year 2000, The Lord of the Rings was the book of the century. The three-part movie version by Peter Jackson is one of the highest-grossing films of all time, and his trilogy of The Hobbit will probably reach the same stratosphere. Yet what makes Tolkien popular? The motifs picked up by his imitators are not all original. Many are the work of this 13th century Icelander, Snorri Sturluson. All the fantasy novels, films, video games, board games, role-playing games, and online multiplayer games that seem to derive their immortal elves, their dwarves in halls of stone, their wandering wizards who talk to birds, and their warrior women from Tolkien have in fact derived them from Snorri. Here are two portraits by modern illustrators depicting Snorri's god, Odin, not, as you might have assumed, Tolkien's wizard Gandalf. In 2001, Neil Gaiman published American Gods. It won the Hugo and Nebula Awards, was the first one book, one Twitter title in 2010, and in 2012 was made into an HBO television series. American Gods essentially updates Snorri's Edda. For both Gaiman and Snorri ask, what do we lose when the old gods are forgotten? Snorri's Odin, in Gaiman's book, goes by the name Mr. Wednesday. In this passage, he reveals himself by paraphrasing Snorri. Quote, his right eye glittered and flashed, his left eye was dull. He wore a cloak with a deep monk-like cowl, and his face stared out from the shadows. I told you I would tell you my names. This is what they call me. I am glad of war, grim, raider, and third. I am one-eyed. I am called highest and true guesser. I am Grimnir, and I am the hooded one. I am Allfather, and I am Gondir wand-bearer. I have as many names as there are winds, as many titles as there are ways to die. Mourned Snorri in his Edda, but these things have now to be told to young poets. They have forgotten the names of Odin. The old lore is dwindling and will soon vanish into neverwhere. But these stories are not to be consigned to oblivion, he insisted. And because of the books he wrote, they were not. The old gods and heroes of the Vikings live on, and our modern culture is enriched by northern fantasy. So I'll be happy to take questions. Shoot. Yes.
Sources, you talk a lot of that.
Tolkien read everything in Icelandic. Tolkien taught Icelandic at Oxford. He translated from Old Icelandic, so he read all of Snorri. He does not. In the late 1900s, early 20th century, Snorri was considered to be an antiquarian, a scholar, who simply wrote down things that people told him. And so he was not given any credit as an author. I see it completely differently. If you look at his life and the reasons that he was writing to impress a 14-year-old king, to gain power and fame, and at what was out there at the time, which was very, very little. Iceland had been Christian for 300 years, 200 years. He made up an awful lot of it. So I see Snorri as a creative writer, whereas Tolkien saw Snorri as a collector. And he called it, instead of Snorri's Edda, which it's always called in Iceland, the Younger Edda. So he does credit the Younger Edda. So kind of credits Snorri. Certainly knew him, but didn't know much about his life. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your pictures to Iceland because we went there, we went hiking and canoeing and biking and ultimately drove around, and it was just a wonderful country to visit. Like I say, anybody who hasn't visited wants to. It's really a remarkable country, and it's not that far away.
I'm going for the 16th time in June. If you ride horses, you can come with me. I'm leading a riding tour. They do.
Story. Do you know how Scandinavia broke up into the various countries? It used to be all one country, Denmark, didn't it? And then how did it get to be Norway, Sweden, and so on?
It happened in the 19th century. The 19th century. The nationalist movement went all through Europe, and Norway managed to break off from Sweden, and they broke off from Denmark somewhere around 1880 to 1920-ish. And Iceland, did the same thing, taking advantage of World War II to make the clean break with Denmark in 1944. So, yeah. And they even have different languages now, and there were different dialects then. But even in the Viking Age, there was a very big distinction between a Norwegian, a Dane, and a Swede. The Norwegians made fun of the Swedes, which they still do. The Icelanders got aggravated if they were called Danes. In England, the Danes and the Norwegians were on different sides of the wars. Yeah.
But the thing is, when you're talking about language, the Vikings, there's evidence of their fishing off Nova Scotia in 600, 700, long before Snorri, and then the Celts coming to England and then establishing tribes there. The origins of the language came from a mixture of all these people, and the Roman as well with the Latin.
I pretty much started 870, so anything before that, I'm just going to nod. But in 870, I know that people from Iceland could speak to people in Scotland, could speak to people in England, could speak to people in Germany and in Denmark without translators. It was probably as difficult for us as us going to the Deep South or something. You'd have to say, huh, what was that? But it was a language, and then they kind of broke out. The Celts were completely different. For the Celts, you needed a translator, but even in the 800s. But there was a lot of similarity in these languages. So I think Barry, you had your hand up a while back.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to a couple of comments you made about Christianity. A little research that I've done on the Vikings, Christianity came very late, at least from the perspective of the rest of Western Europe. And
Depends who you're comparing it to. The Germans were later.
Yeah, as opposed to Southern Europe was good. And when you look at those countries now, while they may be Lutheran basically or Protestant, they're not as deeply religious. I don't think. I get the impression they're not as deeply religious, and yet
they're not as deeply Christian.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good point. That's the point. And despite the fact that Christianity came in, the pagan stories, the sagas and so forth, were so dominant that I didn't get a sense that the Christian myths or the Christian stories were as strong there. That paganism still maintained a strong foothold in the storytelling. Is that
there's a difference between stories and religion. The pagan religion was dying before Iceland was founded in the 870s. We have very little archaeological proof of big religious sites and of religious rituals. There's not much that you can find. We do know that some of the people who came to Iceland favored Thor and some of them favored Freyr. Very few favored Odin. That is another one of Snorri's creations, that he was the high god. But even in the 870s, when they came from Norway, these people had been trading with Christians in Ireland for hundreds of years. And often, in order to trade with Christians, you had to be baptized. So they had a little bit of, understanding of this religion for hundreds of years before they accepted it. And the story in Iceland is that in 999, when Olaf Tryggvason was king of Norway, he decided everybody in the north was going to be Christian. And he sent word to the Icelanders that you are going to become Christian. And they said, and how are you going to make us? He impounded all of the Icelandic ships and crews, including some extremely important men, in Norway and said, you become Iceland or I kill your people. So the few that were, you become Christian, right? Or these Icelanders are not going to come home from Norway. And so there was a meeting at the Althing, the parliament, and people split into the pagan and the Christian factions, and it looked like they were going to come to blows. And the leader of the pagan faction went up to the the leader of the Christian faction went up to the law speaker, who was pagan, and said, you have to do something. And so the pagan then said, well, if I rule on this, will the Christians follow me? And he said yes. And so he supposedly went into his tent and put his cloak over his head and stayed there for a day or so. And he came out and he said, Iceland will be Christian. And the pagan said, what? We were counting on you. And he said, there's no way to get along in this world unless we go along with this. And he said, if what you do in your own homes, we don't care about. So there was sort of that understanding, but there was no religion involved in the decision for Iceland to become Christian. This was politics and trade. This was a marketing decision. Now, when Christianity came into Iceland, it brought a wonderful thing called writing. They had not had any writing except for runes, and runes were not used to tell stories, even though you may have thought or have read somewhere that the sagas were written in runes. They were never written in runes. The only things that were written in runes were, labels, tally sticks, gravestones, things like that, very short bits of text. And so suddenly they had this concept of writing. And so a lot of stories that had been oral were put into writing, but the first things that were put down in the 1030s were sermons, and then by 1117 they wrote the laws, and then a couple of years later the first sagas were written mostly about kings of Norway, and then the sagas of the Icelanders started in about the 1200s, the early 1200s.
But you're talking about Western development. That's ignoring hieroglyphs and Sanskrit.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking about Iceland, this little tiny,
You're talking
yeah.
about
Iceland.
Western
Right. Well, Iceland became Christian. They didn't have a written tradition before that. So, for people who study Icelandic sagas, it was a wonderful thing, that Christianity did bring this technology, and these stories were saved, because otherwise, who knows how long an oral literature lasts. But it wouldn't have lasted this long. We almost lost it before the 1600s. There was only 3 copies of the Edda and 3 copies of Heimskringla in the 1600s. And in the 1700s, 2 of the copies of Heimskringla got burned. Yeah, we were down to 1, except that it had already been published. So we had a printed copy. But yeah, it's like, wow, almost lost that.
So why is it so obscure? If you say it's essential to Western literature.
It had a lot to do with Nazi Germany. That's what Tolkien thought. When Tolkien came back from World War I, he found that it was no longer considered okay to study philology, which is the history of language, because that was a German science. And Icelandic was usually taught in the philology class as having, had an influence on modern English. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I only know the English-speaking world, but really, I don't know that he ever made it down to Italy very well. In the back, you've been waiting.
You. I have a couple of questions. Basically, most people think of Vikings, they think of the raiding and, this kind of brutal kind. And yet, the way you seem to discuss it is that this was an offshoot. These were, just like Champlain came to Newfoundland from France, the people from Norway needed to go someplace, they went to Iceland. So it was really the people, even though they were in Iceland, were in fact the same people as ethnically as the Norwegians.
Yes.
Is that, am I
There's
understanding that?
a couple of different definitions of Viking that are used, and one is to mean the raider, the male warrior that goes raiding in England. What it's used for most now is anyone in the Scandinavian countries during the Viking Age. So, women of the Viking Age is a book title. So I use it in the broader term. So anybody who's alive during the Viking Age, who is from those countries, would be considered a Viking. So there's differences between Icelandic and Norwegian culture, but they are the same people. And Swedish and Danish, and Northern Scotland and Ireland.
The other question I have is I've been reading the Abacus,
Oh, yes, my other book.
and
I think it's here somewhere.
it's, there's all this kind of transmission of culture, of letters going back and forth, be from one place to the next. And the thing that strikes me, that I wonder about, very mundane, how did the letters get carried? How does it get from Cordoba over to, wherever, Rome?
Believe it or not, they walked.
But was
They
there?
really did.
Yeah, so that's basically, they would have somebody they could send with this paper to make this request.
Yeah, she's talking about my book, The Abacus and the Cross. And there's some copies over there, which came out a couple of years ago, which is a biography of Gerbert of Aurillac, who was Pope Sylvester II. He was the Pope from 999 to 1003, so he's during the Viking Age, though he's not a Viking. He was the leading mathematician and astronomer of his time before he became Pope, and he was a great teacher in the cathedral school at Reims. He's the first person in the Christian West to use Arabic numerals to teach mathematics, and he also introduced the astrolabe and some other scientific instruments. He studied near Barcelona, possibly down into Cordoba, maybe not, where all of Barcelona was sort of the border territory between the Christian and the Muslim kingdoms in Spain at that time. And all of our modern science and technology came into the West through Islamic Spain in the Middle Ages. So it had been, all the Greek mathematics was translated into Arabic. The Greek originals are lost. We have it in Latin through Arabic, and it came to us through Spain. And Gerbert was one of the people who helped move technology and science into the north. When I was researching that book, I was constantly astonished to read these, chronicles from, the cathedral at Reims saying, I went from here to there. I went to Rome from Narbonne in January. And you get your map out and you say, okay, what about the Alps? How did you get from Narbonne in January to Rome in January, and cross the Alps? They did it. And there's all kinds of if you read enough of these histories, you get things about having to cross a bridge that had a lot of holes in it. And so he put his shield down and led the horse over that hole. And then he moved his shield and put it down this one and led the horse over that hole. Of crossing a river in a boat and the horse kicks a hole in the side of the boat and the boat is sinking. Okay, everybody made it that time. But, they just did it, and not everybody had a horse. Not everybody could afford a horse. There was people, who would travel with the important person on a horse, and they all had to walk. So they're just doing this a lot, and they're taking letters here and there.
But basically, you're saying that there was a regular.
There was a regular route.
Regular routes, and so if you had a letter that you wanted.
And it was very conveniently punctuated, one day's walk by a monastery.
Okay.
And monasteries at the time were required to take in guests. It was charity. It also became a big business, but it started out as charity. So you could guarantee, unless the weather was really bad or you sprained your ankle, that you could walk from one monastery to the next in a day, and they would take you in.
Is Snorri a national figure in Iceland?
Oh yes, to come back to the present book,
Is he revered?
everybody loves Snorri in Iceland. Yes, there are streets named after him. There's a research institute on the site of his farm. Yeah, children learn about him in school.
Primary sources of their
Yeah, yeah.
Wasn't he a bit of a scoundrel?
He was a scoundrel. Oh yes. What I heard though from an Icelandic friend is, yes, but he was our scoundrel. I went, okay.
He was our scoundrel.
He's your scoundrel. Yes, yes. So they're very proud of him. The way I look at him and what I try to bring out in this book is that he is a human being. He is a flawed human being. He was a celebrity, even in the 1200s. He was the richest man in the country. You look at our celebrities now. How many of them are nice people? Okay, there. Made that point. How many of our great writers are people that you'd want to spend a lot of time with? Hemingway? Yeah, he was not all that different. So even though he was an amazingly good writer, especially for his time, he was a very witty man. He must have been a lot of fun at parties. He did some stupid things, and he certainly was more interested in his own fame than he was in his country's future. Yeah. Well, and I do point out in the book, there's two different histories of what he said to the king on the quay at Bergen. What did he promise the king in 1220? We have two versions. They are both written by his nephew. They contradict each other. So what do? What did he say to the king? We don't know. But in any case, he didn't mean to keep his word.
And I have a question. Did he aspire to becoming king of Iceland?
He wanted to be the top guy. He didn't care what you called him. He would be king, he would be earl, he would be chieftain. Right, he just wanted to be the one in charge. And he was a very great manager. I mean, there are numerous examples of him buying or being given an estate and bringing it back to prosperity. The old guy had run it into the ground, and suddenly Snorri's got it, and it is valuable again. It's making money for him. He was really good.
And a poet,
And a poet.
That's the
Yeah.
remarkable thing is he had
In the back.
How did your Icelandic horses get to Iceland?
How did Icelandic horses get to Iceland? In the Viking ships. There were no land mammals in Iceland when the Vikings arrived, so everything above an Arctic fox came with them, including the mouse. No land mammals, no. It's a very fragile environment, too. So they have these small open boats, and they're bringing with them everything they can bring. Most of the people coming from Norway couldn't go back to Norway because they'd fallen out on the wrong side of the king. So they brought the best of what they had. So you had a lot of chieftains and free farmers bringing their best horse. And these were all interbred in Iceland and left outside all winter with nothing to eat for 1,000 years. And you have a very hardy, comfortable, pleasant, shaggy horse. These horses had to be good to people because they were the only source of anything good. They didn't have anything to run away from except volcanic eruptions. They had to be, very calm so as not to, run into the lava field and break a leg. So that's how they got there. Yes?
What was the relationship between Iceland and Greenland at that time? And how did the Arctic fox get there?
We don't know, but we think on ice flow. Iceland is often, the whole north at least, is often socked in by sea ice in the winter, and polar bears sometimes get onto the country that way too. They are not allowed to live. Foxes, on the other hand, made it and stayed. So that's how they think the fox got there. Greenland was settled from Iceland. It was discovered by Eric the Red in 982. He then went back to Iceland and got 25 ships to follow him and set up a colony, 2 colonies in Greenland. Between then and 1400, when the Greenland colony disappeared, they were trading partners. So the Icelanders and the Greenlanders, it's unclear how much they thought of each other as the same people. But at least in 1400, the last historical account we have of Greenland is of an Icelandic farmer going to Greenland to find the woman who just became the heir to a very large estate in the north of Iceland. And he married her so that he could have the estate and brought her back to Iceland. So that's, how they thought of themselves. Let me find somebody else, Barry. Yeah.
So just think of Jane Smiley's Greenlanders, and she talks a lot about the Inuit people, the native people there. None of those native people were in Iceland?
No. There were no native people in Iceland, and actually there were no native people in that part of Greenland when the Greenlanders were there. Her story is fiction. Yeah. There was interaction with the Greenlanders and the Inuit farther north in Greenland, but the Greenlanders didn't live there. They went up there to hunt. And there was probably interaction in America, but we don't know an awful lot about it. Barry? Okay. They moved into northern Greenland after the Vikings moved into southern Greenland. And then they were moving south as the Vikings were sort of moving up. But the Vikings never really got enough population to really spread out of their 2 original colonies. And so there was very little overlap. And they didn't hunt the same way. So they weren't even in the hunting grounds at the same time. So there was some, especially the 13th and 14th centuries, there was some interaction, even into the 15th century, if they lasted that long. But we don't know how much. Mm-hmm. Anybody else, quick?
It seems to be one of the books that I read about the Vikings.
Uh-huh.
I don't think it was yours. It might have been that fellow from Stromness in namesake. Anyway, I read the story that when the Vikings or the Norwegians went to Iceland, there were already Irish priests there, and that they were sent back to Ireland, or went back to Ireland. Is there any truth to it?
There's a story. In the Landnámabók, which is the Icelandic book of the settlement, which was written in 1130, 1140, they say that when the first settlers from Norway came, they didn't find any people, but they found a cross. And they may have found a bell. And those things have been lost. So there are places in the south of Iceland that are named, Monk's Island, or Monk's Place, or Church Place. And we think those might have been the places that they meant. But you're talking the first people coming in 870, it being written down in 1140, and in that span of time, they've not only lost the objects, they've forgotten exactly which place it is. So this idea that there were Irish there is hanging around since the Middle Ages, but we don't have any proof one way or the other. Yes?
Vikings and the Celtic people, Thames,
Where? Scotland and Ireland?
Ireland.
In the 850s, 870s, when it was getting very hot in Norway because King Harald Fairhair wanted to become the one king of Norway, a lot of the minor kings left, and their people left. And they first went to the Orkney Islands, northern Scotland, the Hebrides, all the way down the outer islands to Dublin. They founded the city of Dublin as a trading port. They founded a couple of other places in Ireland that now escape my memory. And they lived there for at least 100 years, constantly at war with, but also intermarrying with, the Celtic people. So you have at least a 200-year span where there was a whole lot of Viking settlements there. And then the Vikings decided, some of them went from Ireland and Scotland to Iceland, bringing with them their Irish families, or Celtic families. And Iceland now is something like 60% Norwegian and 40% Celtic by DNA studies. Yes, it's DNA studies, yeah. And the interesting little twist in that is that they did the men and the women differently. Icelandic men are 80% Norwegian and 20% Celtic. Icelandic women are 60% Celtic and 40% Norwegian. So you can see that the men came from Norway, stayed in the Celtic areas, took wives. We don't know what took wives mean. Did they want to go or not? And took them to Iceland. You have some of the people that are recorded in the Book of Settlements. There's even the one female chieftain in all of Icelandic history came from Scotland. And we don't know how Scottish she was, but she came from Scotland. And brought a lot of Scottish people with her. So did they want to come or not? We don't really know, but many of them did. Yes?
So what does the term Norse
It depends who you ask. I often prefer to use Icelandic. Norse is used usually for the common language of the Middle Ages, Old Norse or Norse. It can also just be used, as I use Viking, for anybody who lived in that area and spoke that language. Any general Northman that you can't pin Swedish, Danish, or Norwegian on. So it's a more general term. But it's usually generally used in the Middle Ages. Way over there.
Sorry to point to the last question, but I want to know which of the Norse myths that Snorri wrote was your favorite.
Which of the Norse myths is my favorite? Well, I gave you two of my favorites here, the creation story and the mead of poetry. But of course, I'm very fond of the story of Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse. Obviously. So I'm not going to tell you that one, but you can read it in the book. Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by Odin sacrificing himself to Odin.
Yeah.
Hanging himself on the world tree, and
That's very problematic because we have one source,
and that's
which is one poem. It's not in Snorri.
it's not.
It's not in Snorri. It's in one poem, The Song of the Sibyl, which has pretty much been proven to have been written in Iceland after Christianity came.
Yeah.
So it is heavily influenced by Christianity. We don't know. Is it a conscious reference to Christ? It could be. So it's one of those enigmas we're not going to answer with one source, unfortunately. Okay, so that's the end of the questions. I have some books for sale. I'll be willing to sign anything if anybody has a book they brought with them or whatever. And thank you. Thank you.
Fabulous.
Good. Well, I'll pick up my computer.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nancy. That was outstanding. She also has a blog, if anyone wants to know, on the internet. And she just posted this one thing today, I think it was God of Wednesday. I think that's what you got of Wednesday. So, and it's really fantastic. I looked at it today. We took the link for her blog and we put it on our Facebook page if anybody wants to get a hold of it. Well, thanks very much for coming, everybody, and have a safe ride home. Thanks so much.